In the winter of 16th century Japan, when discipline meant survival and weakness meant disappearance, a young samurai named Hiroshi stood frozen in the courtyard of his master's dojo. He had studied longer than most, read more than anyone his age, memorized every teaching placed before him, yet he felt smaller every day. Around him, newer students moved with ease, their strikes fluid, their minds calm. Hiroshi's chest burned with confusion and anger. He believed intelligence was power. He believed knowing more would make him stronger. But reality was humiliating him. His master watched silently, not with disappointment, but with understanding. Finally, he spoke words that would shatter Hiroshi's identity. Your problem is not lack of talent. Your problem is that you think you already know. Those words cut deeper than steel. Because for the first time, Hiroshi realized something terrifying, the knowledge he was so proud of had become a cage. This moment marks the beginning of a truth most people never confront. We are taught from childhood that intelligence, education, and certainty are advantages. We reward quick answers, confident opinions, and the appearance of mastery. But the samurai understood a paradox that modern society ignores: the mind that believes it is full has no room to grow. Hiroshi had mistaken familiarity for mastery, understanding for embodiment. He knew the techniques in theory, but his body rejected them. His mind was crowded with assumptions, comparisons, and ego. Each lesson passed through a filter of "I already know this," and whatever didn't fit was quietly discarded. Meanwhile, beginners with empty minds absorbed everything. They didn't argue with instruction. They didn't defend their identity. They simply received. What Hiroshi was experiencing was not failure, it was resistance. Resistance created by identity. When learning becomes tied to ego, progress slows. Every correction feels like an attack. Every mistake feels like humiliation. Growth becomes painful instead of natural. The samurai knew this state well. They observed that the fastest learners were rarely the most gifted or intelligent. They were the most open. The ones willing to be clumsy. The ones unafraid of appearing ignorant. The ones who approached every lesson as if it were their first. This state was not weakness. It was power disguised as humility. Hiroshi's master explained it without comfort. You approach training as someone who wants to prove himself, he said. Others approach training as someone who wants to disappear into the practice. The difference was everything. Hiroshi trained to protect his self-image. Others trained to dissolve theirs. That single distinction separated stagnation from mastery. Because when the mind is busy protecting its identity, it cannot fully engage with reality. It reacts instead of responding. It clings instead of adapting. This lesson is not confined to ancient Japan. It lives everywhere today. In classrooms where students stop asking questions once they feel smart enough. In careers where professionals plateau because they believe they've figured it out. In creative work where early success hardens into rigid style. The same invisible wall appears again and again. The moment you believe you are no longer a beginner, learning slows to a crawl. Confidence turns into blindness. Knowledge turns into inertia. The samurai called this trap the full cup. A cup already filled cannot receive fresh water, no matter how pure it is. Hiroshi's cup overflowed with theories, comparisons, and pride. Every drop of new insight spilled away. His master did not punish him for this. He redirected him. If you want to progress, he said, you must first become empty. Not empty of intelligence, but empty of certainty. Empty of the need to be right. Empty of the illusion that knowing something is the same as living it. That night, Hiroshi sat alone, replaying the words again and again. For the first time, he questioned the identity he had built his entire life around. What if his greatest strength was actually his greatest weakness? What if intelligence, without humility, slowed him down instead of lifting him up? This realization was uncomfortable, almost unbearable. But it cracked something open. And through that crack, the possibility of real mastery finally entered. This is where true learning begins, not with accumulation, but with release. Not with proving, but with surrender. The samurai path did not start by adding more techniques, more information, more effort. It began by removing what blocked perception. By unlearning arrogance. By returning to the mental state of a beginner, curious, alert, flexible, and unburdened by expectation. Hiroshi did not know it yet, but this moment marked the first step toward learning faster than almost everyone around him. Not because he would become smarter, but because he would finally become empty enough to grow. As the weeks passed, Hiroshi began to notice a pattern that disturbed him more than failure ever had. Every time his master corrected his stance or movement, a quiet resistance rose inside him. His mind rushed to defend itself. I've read this, I understand the theory, I shouldn't be struggling with something so basic. That resistance was invisible to others, but it shaped everything. His body tightened. His reactions slowed. His awareness narrowed. Meanwhile, the students he once dismissed moved freely, unburdened by comparison. They listened without arguing internally. They failed without shame. They learned without friction. Hiroshi realized that learning was not being blocked by lack of effort, but by the constant noise of his own self-importance. The samurai never confused effort with progress. They observed that two people could train equally hard, yet advance at completely different speeds. The difference was not discipline, strength, or intelligence. It was mental posture. One trained to confirm what he already believed. The other trained to discover what he did not yet see. Hiroshi trained with conclusions. Others trained with questions. And questions, unlike conclusions, leave space for growth. This distinction revealed something painful: intelligence can quietly turn into arrogance if it is not balanced by humility. Hiroshi's education had trained him to seek correct answers, not deeper awareness. He wanted certainty. He wanted validation. He wanted to feel ahead. But mastery does not reward certainty, it rewards sensitivity. It requires the ability to feel subtle feedback, notice small errors, and adjust without emotional resistance. The more Hiroshi tried to protect his self-image as the smart one, the less sensitive he became. His ego dulled his perception. One morning, his master asked him a simple question: when was the last time you truly listened? Hiroshi wanted to answer immediately, but hesitated. Listening, he realized, was not waiting to respond or filtering words through his own opinions. True listening meant allowing instruction to enter without interference. It meant suspending judgment. It meant being willing to be wrong. Hiroshi saw that he rarely listened that way. His mind was always preparing a response, a comparison, a defense. In doing so, he missed the lesson itself. This is why beginners often outperform intermediates. Beginners have nothing to protect. No reputation. No identity tied to being good. Every correction is a gift, not an insult. Every mistake is information, not failure. The samurai understood this deeply. They knew that the most dangerous moment in training was not ignorance, but premature confidence. The moment a warrior thought, "I know this," he stopped refining. The blade dulled without him noticing. Hiroshi began to see how this applied beyond the dojo. In conversation, people listened to reply, not to understand. In work, people defended old methods instead of adapting. In life, people repeated patterns because admitting ignorance felt threatening. Knowledge became armor, not insight. And armor, while protective, also restricts movement. It makes you slower. Less responsive. Less alive. His master explained it simply: the mind that clings cannot flow. When the mind clings to what it knows, it becomes rigid. When it releases, it becomes adaptable. The samurai valued adaptability above all else. Battles were unpredictable. Conditions changed instantly. Only those who could respond without hesitation survived. This was not achieved through memorization, but through presence. Presence requires emptiness. A mind crowded with certainty reacts late. Slowly, painfully, Hiroshi began to practice letting go. Not dramatically, but quietly. When corrected, he stopped explaining himself. When confused, he stopped pretending to understand. When practicing basics, he stopped rushing through them. He began asking a new question in his mind: what am I missing? This single question changed everything. It softened his body. It widened his perception. It made learning feel lighter. This was the first shift, not in skill, but in orientation. Hiroshi was no longer trying to prove he belonged. He was learning how to disappear into the practice. And in that disappearance, something unexpected began to happen. The pressure lifted. The tension eased. And for the first time since he had entered the dojo, progress felt natural instead of forced. The cup was not empty yet, but it was no longer overflowing. The change in Hiroshi was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. His movements did not suddenly become faster or stronger. He did not outperform his peers overnight. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Training no longer felt like a test of worth. It became an exploration. Each repetition turned into a question rather than a performance. Instead of asking whether he looked competent, Hiroshi began asking whether he felt the movement clearly. That single change transformed every session. The samurai believed that the body learns faster than the mind when the mind stops interfering. For weeks, Hiroshi had tried to think his way into mastery, stacking knowledge upon knowledge. Now, he practiced with fewer thoughts. He focused on sensation, the pressure of his feet against the ground, the alignment of his spine, the rhythm of his breath. When his master corrected him, he did not analyze or debate. He adjusted and felt the difference. Learning became physical, not conceptual. This was unsettling at first. Without his familiar mental framework, Hiroshi felt exposed. There was no intellectual shield to hide behind. Mistakes were no longer abstract errors, they were immediate, embodied feedback. Yet this vulnerability carried unexpected power. Each mistake taught him something precise. Each correction landed deeper because it was not filtered through ego. The samurai called this state direct contact, when experience speaks louder than explanation. As Hiroshi practiced, he noticed something remarkable. The beginners he once envied were not magically talented. They were simply present. They weren't chasing progress or fearing regression. They responded to what was happening in front of them. Hiroshi realized that mastery was not built by force, but by attention. The more attention he gave to the present moment, the less effort he needed to improve. This went against everything he had been taught about working harder to get better. His master reinforced this lesson by removing complexity instead of adding it. Advanced techniques were set aside. Hiroshi was instructed to practice the most basic movements for hours, days, weeks. At first, his frustration returned. He wanted advancement. He wanted proof that he was improving. But gradually, he noticed details he had never felt before. Tiny shifts in balance changed everything. Small adjustments in timing made movements effortless. The basics were not simple, they were endless. The samurai trained this way because they understood a brutal truth: under pressure, complexity collapses. Only what is deeply embodied remains. Fancy techniques disappear when fear enters the body. Fundamentals, practiced with full attention, survive. Hiroshi began to understand that speed and precision were side effects, not goals. They emerged naturally when the foundation was solid. Trying to force them only created tension. This lesson extended beyond the dojo. Hiroshi saw it in craftspeople, artists, and warriors alike. Those who progressed fastest were not chasing novelty. They refined essentials relentlessly. They embraced boredom. They trusted repetition. While others searched for shortcuts, these individuals deepened their roots. Their progress was quiet, but unstoppable. One evening, after a long session of basic drills, Hiroshi felt something he had never experienced before: calm certainty. Not the loud confidence of ego, but a quiet trust in his own body. He did not feel advanced. He felt grounded. For the first time, he was no longer rushing toward mastery. He was building it. This was the samurai's hidden advantage. By emptying the mind and grounding attention in the body, they learned faster than those who relied on intellect alone. Hiroshi was beginning to see that real learning was not about collecting information, but about becoming sensitive enough to reality that information was no longer needed. The path was slower on the surface, but deeper beneath. And depth, once established, could not be shaken. By the fourth phase of his transformation, Hiroshi no longer measured progress in visible wins or praise from his master. Something more internal had begun to guide him. He noticed that on days when he tried to impress, his movements became stiff and fragmented. On days when he arrived with no expectations, his body moved smoothly, almost without instruction. This contrast revealed a deeper truth: intention shapes outcome long before technique does. The samurai understood that the mind is either a bridge or a barrier. When Hiroshi trained with the desire to prove himself, his attention scattered. Part of him watched his own performance, part anticipated judgment, and part clung to past mistakes. But when he trained with a beginner's attitude, his awareness gathered into a single point. Every strike, every step, every breath aligned. Efficiency replaced effort. His master began introducing pressure, not through harder techniques, but through unpredictability. Attacks came without warning. Instructions changed mid-movement. Silence replaced explanation. At first, Hiroshi struggled. His old habit was to pause and think. But thinking created delay. Delay created hesitation. And hesitation created openings. Slowly, he learned to respond instead of analyze. His body adjusted in real time, guided by awareness rather than memory. This was when Hiroshi realized that most people do not fail because they lack ability, but because they cling to certainty. They want to know what will happen next. They want reassurance. The beginner's mind accepts uncertainty as part of the process. It does not resist confusion. It uses it. Every unexpected moment becomes fresh information instead of a threat. Outside the dojo, Hiroshi observed the same pattern in everyday life. Merchants who adapted thrived. Those who clung to old methods struggled. Students who asked questions grew faster than those who defended their intelligence. The principle was universal: rigidity slows learning, openness accelerates it. The samurai path was not limited to combat. It was a method for navigating reality itself. During meditation, Hiroshi noticed how often his mind tried to label experiences. Good practice. Bad practice. Progress. Failure. Each label created distance between him and what was actually happening. His teacher instructed him to drop the labels. Feel the movement without naming it. Observe the breath without judging it. When labels disappeared, clarity increased. The moment became simple, and simplicity revealed truth. There were days when frustration returned, but now Hiroshi recognized it as a signal, not an obstacle. Frustration meant expectation had returned. It meant the cup was filling again. Instead of fighting the feeling, he acknowledged it and returned to basics. This ability to reset became one of his greatest strengths. He no longer feared setbacks because he understood they were part of the cycle. The samurai trained this way because battle allows no second chances. Overthinking costs lives. Presence saves them. Hiroshi was not yet a master, but he was becoming reliable. His movements held consistency. His reactions carried calm. Others began to notice. Not because he stood out, but because he no longer struggled. What Hiroshi discovered in this stage was simple but profound: mastery does not come from control, but from cooperation with reality. When you stop forcing outcomes and start responding fully, progress accelerates naturally. The beginner's mind does not rush ahead. It meets each moment exactly as it is. And in that meeting, true skill is born. By the fifth stage of his journey, Hiroshi began to understand that beginner's mind was not something you switch on once and keep forever. It was fragile. It required protection. Each small success carried danger, because success whispers the lie that effort is no longer required. Hiroshi noticed how praise from other students subtly changed his posture. His chest lifted, his awareness narrowed, and without realizing it, the cup began to fill again. His master addressed this directly, not with criticism, but with redirection. One morning, after Hiroshi executed a form with exceptional smoothness, the master simply said, "Do it again, but forget what you just did." The instruction confused him. Forget success. But when he tried to repeat the form while holding on to the previous result, the movement collapsed. Only when he released the memory did the flow return. This revealed a critical truth: yesterday's success is today's obstacle. The moment you try to replicate perfection, you stop discovering. Hiroshi saw how many warriors peak early and then stagnate, endlessly copying their own past achievements. The beginner's mind refuses to worship memory. It treats each repetition as a new encounter, not a reenactment. Training intensified, not through complexity, but through repetition of the simplest actions. Basic footwork. Fundamental strikes. Ordinary breathing. At first glance, it seemed like regression. But Hiroshi felt something different happening beneath the surface. Subtle refinements emerged. Micro-adjustments in balance. A quieter grip. A smoother transfer of weight. These improvements could only appear because the basics were no longer rushed. He realized that most people abandon fundamentals too early. They crave advanced techniques because fundamentals feel boring once familiarity sets in. But boredom is not a signal to move on. It is a signal that attention has weakened. The samurai understood that depth hides inside repetition, not novelty. Hiroshi learned to treat boredom as a gate. If he stayed present long enough, the gate always opened. Outside training, this lesson echoed everywhere. Conversations became deeper when he listened without preparing responses. Tasks became easier when he focused on process instead of outcome. Even walking through the marketplace felt different. Colors sharper. Sounds clearer. The beginner's mind was not limited to training hours. It reshaped perception itself. There were moments when Hiroshi felt tempted to teach others, to display what he had learned. Each time, his master reminded him, "Teach only what you can still question." This restraint kept Hiroshi grounded. He spoke less and observed more. When he did share insight, it came from experience, not identity. He was not a man trying to appear wise. He was a student describing what he had seen. One evening, during meditation, a realization surfaced quietly. The fastest learners are not those who push hardest, but those who resist least. Resistance shows up as comparison, impatience, and pride. Remove resistance, and learning flows naturally. Hiroshi felt gratitude for every moment of confusion he once resented. Confusion had been the doorway all along. By the end of this phase, Hiroshi no longer measured himself against others. Competition dissolved into curiosity. Every person became a potential teacher. Every mistake became usable data. The cup was not empty once, but emptied again and again. And in that repeated emptiness, Hiroshi began to sense the deeper rhythm of mastery, not a straight climb upward, but a continuous return to the beginning. By the sixth phase of his transformation, Hiroshi discovered that beginner's mind was not only tested during training, but most severely during moments of pressure. Calm practice was easy. Chaos revealed truth. When stress entered the body, the ego rushed back in, demanding control, certainty, and guarantees. Hiroshi began to notice this pattern clearly. The tighter the situation, the louder the voice that said, "I must get this right." And every time that voice appeared, his movements became rigid. Master Tiyada designed the next stage specifically to expose this weakness. He placed Hiroshi in unfamiliar conditions on purpose. Training at odd hours. Practicing with exhaustion. Sparring with unpredictable partners. The goal was not skill refinement, but awareness. Each time Hiroshi tried to rely on preparation alone, he failed. Each time he relaxed into openness, his body adapted faster than thought. One exercise stood out. Hiroshi was told to spar blindfolded, relying only on sound, breath, and intuition. Panic surged immediately. His mind scrambled for techniques, strategies, remembered forms. None of them worked. He stumbled repeatedly. Only after several failures did something shift. He stopped trying to win. He stopped trying to remember. He listened. He felt air displacement. He sensed rhythm. Suddenly, his body moved on its own. After the session, Tiyada explained the lesson. In pressure, the mind tries to dominate. It believes control equals safety. But control blocks perception. Beginner's mind restores sensitivity. When you stop forcing outcomes, awareness expands. Hiroshi realized that true calm was not the absence of danger, but the absence of resistance to danger. This insight carried into everyday life. Hiroshi noticed how often people panic not because situations are difficult, but because their expectations are violated. When reality does not match the plan, frustration erupts. Beginner's mind dissolves this friction. It expects nothing. It meets what is. Hiroshi practiced this consciously. When plans changed, he paused instead of reacting. When mistakes happened, he observed before correcting. Each pause strengthened his adaptability. The most difficult challenge came when Hiroshi faced public evaluation. Other students watched him closely now. Some admired him. Others waited for him to fail. Old insecurities stirred. The desire to protect reputation tempted him to play safe, to rely on proven techniques. But he remembered the principle: safety breeds stagnation. Growth lives where certainty ends. During one public demonstration, Hiroshi intentionally attempted a movement he had never fully mastered. It was risky. His balance wavered. He nearly failed. But the act itself broke something inside him, the fear of looking imperfect. The audience saw effort, not polish. Presence, not performance. And paradoxically, the movement succeeded because he was no longer guarding his image. That day, Hiroshi understood a deeper layer of emptiness. Ego is not only pride. Ego is also fear of failure. Both fill the cup. Beginner's mind empties both by refusing to define identity through outcome. Success and failure become information, nothing more. As weeks passed, Hiroshi's confidence changed texture. It was no longer loud or defensive. It was quiet, flexible, and responsive. He trusted himself not because he knew what would happen, but because he trusted his ability to respond to whatever did. This trust did not come from mastery of technique, but from mastery of mindset. By the end of this stage, Hiroshi realized that beginner's mind is not weakness disguised as humility. It is strength stripped of arrogance. It is power without tension. And once this way of being is embodied, pressure no longer collapses the practitioner. It sharpens them. The cup remains empty, not because nothing is inside, but because nothing is clung to. This was the turning point where Hiroshi stopped training to become better and started training to become available to reality, to learning, to each moment as it actually was. And from that availability, true mastery began to accelerate. By the seventh stage of Hiroshi's journey, a quiet shift had taken place. Training no longer felt like effort layered on top of resistance. It felt like cooperation with reality. He noticed that when beginner's mind was stable, learning stopped feeling heavy. Movements improved without struggle, understanding deepened without forcing, and progress arrived without the anxiety of chasing it. Master Tiada now gave fewer instructions. Silence became the teacher. Hiroshi was expected to notice his own habits, his own subtle returns of ego. The most dangerous moments were no longer frustration or failure, but success. Praise from others, victories in sparring, recognition from seniors, each carried the risk of filling the cup again. During one session, a junior student asked Hiroshi for guidance. The old impulse surfaced instantly: explain, demonstrate, correct. Hiroshi stopped himself. Instead, he watched the student move and asked a single question. What do you feel when your weight shifts? The student paused, reflected, and adjusted naturally. Hiroshi realized that teaching without ego required more restraint than teaching with authority. This became a new practice. Speak less. Observe more. Allow discovery instead of delivering answers. Hiroshi saw how often people steal learning from others by explaining too quickly. Beginner's mind respects timing. It lets insight emerge instead of imposing it. Outside the dojo, Hiroshi tested this approach in daily interactions. Conversations changed. Instead of preparing responses, he listened fully. Instead of proving points, he asked better questions. Conflicts softened. People opened up. He discovered that presence disarms tension faster than argument ever could. One evening, while walking alone, Hiroshi reflected on how his identity had shifted. He no longer thought of himself as talented or untalented, advanced or behind. Those labels had lost meaning. Progress was no longer measured against others, but against awareness itself. Was he open, or was he defending? Tiada later confirmed this insight. Comparison is the enemy of mastery, he said. The moment you measure yourself against others, you leave the present. Beginner's mind has no rivals. Only lessons. These words settled deeply. Hiroshi also noticed something unexpected. Joy returned to practice. Not excitement or pride, but quiet enjoyment. The childlike pleasure of discovering small improvements. This joy became fuel, far more sustainable than ambition or fear. At this stage, discipline no longer required force. Consistency emerged naturally because resistance had dissolved. Hiroshi trained daily not because he had to, but because it felt incomplete not to. Beginner's mind had transformed discipline from obligation into expression. He understood now why so many people quit learning. They associate progress with pressure. But pressure comes from ego, not from practice. Remove the ego, and effort becomes light. By the end of this phase, Hiroshi no longer asked how long mastery would take. Time had become irrelevant. Each day was complete on its own. And in that completeness, the path itself became the destination. By the 8th phase of his journey, Hiroshi began to understand that beginner's mind was not something he used during practice. It was something he lived inside. It shaped how he woke up, how he moved, how he responded to the smallest disruptions of the day. What once felt like a technique had become a way of seeing. Master Tiada introduced a final refinement. You have learned to empty your cup during effort, he said. Now you must learn to empty it during certainty. This confused Hiroshi. Effort was hard. Uncertainty was uncomfortable. But certainty felt safe. Tiada explained that certainty is more dangerous than confusion because it disguises stagnation as confidence. To train this, Hiroshi was assigned repetition without variation. The same basic movements, the same sequence, every morning for weeks. At first, boredom surfaced immediately. His mind searched for novelty, improvement, stimulation. Tiada stopped him. Boredom is ego's impatience. Stay. So Hiroshi stayed. As days passed, something unexpected happened. The movements began to change without changing. Subtle details emerged. Weight distribution shifted by millimeters. Breath synchronized naturally. Tension revealed itself in places he had never noticed. What he thought was repetition was actually deepening perception. Hiroshi realized that most people abandon fundamentals not because they have mastered them, but because they have stopped seeing them. Beginner's mind restores vision. It turns repetition into exploration. The same action becomes a new lesson each time, not because the action changes, but because awareness does. This principle extended far beyond training. Hiroshi noticed how people repeat the same mistakes in relationships, work, and habits because they assume they already understand the situation. They stop observing. They stop listening. Beginner's mind interrupts this cycle by forcing fresh attention onto familiar patterns. Tiyada explained that mastery is not accumulation of techniques, but refinement of perception. A dull mind needs variety, he said. A sharp mind finds infinity in simplicity. These words reshaped how Hiroshi approached everything, from conversation to silence. The most profound shift came when Hiroshi stopped seeking progress altogether. He trained without expectation of outcome. Some days felt powerful. Others felt clumsy. Neither mattered. Each day was complete. This removed pressure entirely, allowing learning to accelerate without friction. During a quiet evening practice, Hiroshi experienced a moment of clarity. There was no sense of self-improving or failing. Only movement happening, breath flowing, awareness watching without judgment. Time dissolved. Effort disappeared. Practice practiced itself. Afterward, Tiyada spoke softly. This is not enlightenment. Do not cling to it. But remember this feeling. It shows you what happens when nothing blocks learning. Hiroshi understood. Even insight must be held lightly, or it becomes another thing that fills the cup. By the end of this phase, Hiroshi no longer feared stagnation. He saw that stagnation only appears when attention fades. As long as beginner's mind remained alive, even standing still was movement. Even silence was instruction. And with that realization, the path ahead felt endlessly open. By the 9th stage, Hiroshi began to recognize beginner's mind not as a personal advantage, but as a responsibility. His presence now influenced others. Students trained differently when he was near. Conversations shifted. Tension softened. He realized that mindset is contagious, and emptiness creates space not only for oneself, but for everyone around. Master Tiyada warned him of the final internal trap. When others benefit from your presence, he said, pride will try to return wearing the mask of humility. Hiroshi understood. Feeling needed, admired, or respected can quietly rebuild the ego faster than arrogance ever could. To counter this, Hiroshi practiced intentional invisibility. He stepped back during discussions. He let others receive credit. When praised, he acknowledged it without feeding it. This was not self-denial, but self-discipline. Beginner's mind does not reject recognition, it simply does not attach to it. During one training cycle, a younger student surpassed him in speed and precision. Observers expected rivalry. Hiroshi felt none. Instead, curiosity arose. What does he see that I don't? He asked himself. Watching closely, he discovered subtle efficiencies in movement that he immediately integrated. Ego would have rejected the lesson. Beginner's mind welcomed it. Hiroshi now saw clearly why many skilled people plateau. They unconsciously protect their status. Growth would threaten identity. Beginner's mind dissolves identity, allowing progress without fear. This insight extended into conflict. When disagreements arose, Hiroshi stopped defending positions. He defended understanding instead. He listened until the other person felt fully seen. Often, resistance dissolved without resolution. He learned that many conflicts are not about being right, but about being recognized. Tiyada later explained, the warrior who wins arguments loses awareness. The warrior who seeks understanding gains allies. This lesson changed how Hiroshi viewed strength. Power was no longer domination. It was adaptability combined with restraint. As responsibility increased, Hiroshi refined his daily rituals. Each morning began with a brief pause, a conscious release of yesterday's conclusions. Each evening ended with reflection, not on performance, but on openness. Where had ego appeared? Where had curiosity remained alive? The practice became subtle, almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it was relentless. Beginner's mind had become a filter through which all experience passed. When tension appeared, it was examined. When confidence arose, it was softened. Nothing was allowed to harden into identity. By the end of this stage, Hiroshi understood the final paradox. Mastery is not about standing above others. It is about standing nowhere in particular. Rooted, flexible, ungraspable. And from that place of quiet emptiness, influence flows naturally, without effort or control. By the final stage of his journey, Hiroshi no longer thought of himself as someone who had achieved mastery. That idea had quietly dissolved. What remained was commitment, not to a title, not to an image, but to a way of meeting each moment without resistance. Years had passed, and new students now entered the dojo carrying the same confidence, impatience, and hunger Hiroshi once carried. He recognized it immediately, not with judgment, but with understanding. He saw himself in their certainty, in their urgency to arrive somewhere quickly. Hiroshi taught differently than most masters. He demonstrated less. He explained sparingly. Instead, he created conditions. Silence, repetition, discomfort, attention. He knew that true learning cannot be transferred, it must be uncovered. When students struggled, he did not rush to fix them. When they succeeded, he did not rush to praise them. Both reactions could steal awareness. His guidance was subtle, almost invisible. A question at the right moment. A pause that forced reflection. A gesture that redirected attention inward. One evening, a student asked the question Hiroshi once asked long ago. "Master, how long will it take to become truly skilled?" Hiroshi smiled. "The moment you stop measuring time," he replied, "you will already be learning faster than most." He understood now that beginner's mind is not something one attains and keeps. It is something one chooses, again and again. Every day presents the same fork in the road: defend what you know, or discover what you don't. Hiroshi continued his own practice quietly. Each morning, he emptied the cup. Each evening, he checked whether it had filled again. This simple ritual kept his awareness sharp, his movements alive, his learning continuous. He no longer feared stagnation or decline. Aging, mistakes, even loss were simply new teachers. Beginner's mind welcomed them all. Where others resisted change, Hiroshi adapted. Where others clung to certainty, he stayed curious. The lesson that began with frustration had completed its circle. The fastest path to mastery was never accumulation. It was subtraction. Remove ego. Remove certainty. Remove the need to arrive. What remains is presence. And presence, Hiroshi knew, is what allows anyone, in any era, in any discipline, to learn faster than 99% of people. Not through force. Not through brilliance. But through the quiet power of remaining a beginner forever.